Hey everybody, this is John with another installment of Think Culture. I received a comment recently asking me if there'd been any more word from Giorgio Agamben with respect to the pandemic and the biosecurity measures which had been and continued to be implemented in the name of dealing with the pandemic. And I didn't know really. I hadn't kept up with him actually. But so in response to that, I went and looked, and I used the translation feature again and everything, and I tried to kind of get some of the translation that I'm going to go through with you, along with some commentary and stuff like that from me. But yeah, I figured we'd touch base again with Mr. Agamben, and we'll go ahead and talk about what he's been saying. Some of it's interesting, some of it's new, most of it's kind of rehashing, but not all of it. To begin with, I was going to read his speech that he gave, I guess, in Senate on October 7th, 2021. This is going to be kind of out of order. Sorry. It doesn't matter much, I don't think. But so in this speech, he's talking about the Green Pass. A lot of this is about the Green Pass. So I went ahead and also tried to update myself with respect to the Green Pass politically and what's going on in Italy and stuff. And they've moved from Green Pass to Super Green Pass. In February, I guess they're going, that's now. So in February, sometime in a week, 2 weeks, whatever, they're supposed to start implementing absolutely compulsory vaccination. The first phase of it that's been announced is for people, I think, over 50. But yeah, there's been a kind of snowball effect, as you'll kind of see from some of the stuff he's talking about here. And he talks a lot about things like, oh, you're not allowed to go to the cinema or whatever without a Green Pass. Recently, they've even made it so you can't go to a bank. So when your access to financial institutions and stuff like that is also affected, it's kind of, that's kind of an acceleration of the problem and what he's talking about here. But yeah, so I wanted to start basically by pretty much just reading his speech to the Senate on October 7th, 2021. I'm going to skip a little bit at the beginning. Because he starts by talking about how the government had, different pieces of legislation. And he says the government has given itself legal immunity from damages caused by the vaccine, which, we also hear even the companies developing them have legal immunity. I don't know if that's the case in Italy or not, probably. But anyway, so he begins by talking about how they have legal immunity from any damages caused by it. And he says they don't feel like taking responsibility for a vaccine which has not completed testing, and at the same time, we are trying to force all citizens to vaccinate with every possible means available to them, otherwise barring them from social life. And now with the bill before you, even the opportunity to work. And, we're seeing conversations about stuff like this in the United States too. Even private companies requiring it and what that means and whether that's different and to what extent. But yeah, they're discussing here too. And he goes on to say, is it possible to imagine a situation which is more legally and morally abnormal? They accuse the unvaccinated of irresponsibility, while they formally eschew responsibility from any deleterious effects of the vaccination. The Parliament should reflect on this legal monstrosity. And then he goes on, my second point is not the medical dimensions of the Green Pass, but the political ones. And he says they tend to talk about it in terms of, the Green Pass isn't really anything. It's not a problem. It's not significant in itself. It's to get people to be vaccinated. And he says we ought to think about it in the reverse way, which is that the Green Pass doesn't exist to get people vaccinated, which is medically necessary or whatever, but the vaccinations exist to get people onto this system of the Green Pass. So the purpose is political in this sense. And this is a device, he says, that allows the government to control and track people to an unprecedented extent. Political scientists have long said that we've transitioned from what was called disciplinary society, that's Foucault, I've talked about disciplinary society in a few videos, to that of societies of control. If you're interested in that phraseology and what that means, you can look up Deleuze's Postscript to Societies of Control. It's a short piece. And that's where this idea comes from. I would recommend reading that. founded on virtually unlimited digital control of individual behaviors, which thus become quantifiable in algorithms. We're now getting used to all these devices of control, but how far are we willing to go along and accept this? Is it possible that we are now, as citizens in a supposedly democratic society, in a worse situation than that of citizens in Stalin's Soviet Union? And he says, they were required to show a propiska, some kind of passport, I guess, to travel from, he says país. I believe he's referring to state here. I don't know the details about this history. But they were required to show something like a passport to travel, I think, from one state within Russia to another state. And he says, but we must even show it to go to the cinema or to a restaurant. Or now more seriously, potentially to go to work. And as I said, even banking and stuff is involved now. And he goes on, everything suggests that these decrees, following upon one another as if emanating from a single person, must be framed as part of a process of transformation of the institutions and government paradigms that is all the more insidious since, as happened with fascism, they take place without altering the text of the Constitution itself. The model that is progressively eroded and canceled is that of parliamentary democracy. Remember, he's speaking in front of the parliament here. With their rights and constitutional guarantees, and in their place, a paradigm of government takes over in which, in the name of biosecurity and control, individual freedoms are destined to suffer ever-increasing limitations. The explicit focus on infection and health prevents us from seeing clearly the great political transformations that are taking place, and from realizing that, as the governments themselves do not tire of reminding us, security and emergency are not transitory phenomena, but constitute a new form of governmentality. In this perspective, it is more urgent than ever for you to consider with extreme attention this transformation, which is in the long run destined to empty the parliament of its powers, reducing it, as it is now happening, to approve in the name of biosecurity decrees that emanate from organizations and people who have very little to do with parliament. So these extra political actors are eroding, are capturing sovereignty that in the age of bourgeois democracies was possessed by parliament. Okay, I thought that was pretty good, so I was thinking I would just pretty much read that to you as it is. But now I'm going to start going through some of the other ones. So he has one called A Community in Society. And I thought this was really interesting because, we'll see. But I don't know if you guys are familiar with like the Benedict option. That's Rod Dreher wrote that, right? And so there's this idea that's become kind of more popular in recent years on the right about the Benedict option, in which, you just exit from society, form our own communities, form our own institutions, just be done with it. And that's what he's talking about here. He says, Italy is as the political laboratory of the West, in which the strategies of the dominant powers are elaborated in advance in their extreme form, is today a country humanly and politically in disrepair, in which an unscrupulous and determined tyranny has allied itself with a mass in the grip of a pseudo-religious terror, ready to sacrifice not only what were once called constitutional freedoms, but all the warmth of human relations. He thinks that it would be naive to think that the Green Pass is somehow going to lead us to normalcy, which is what people like to say. They like to say here too. And he's like, dude, just as a third vaccine is already being imposed, we will continue to see new vaccines, new emergency situations, new red zones declared from time to time, as long as the government and the ruling class view these things as useful. In these conditions, it may be useful for dissidents to consider creating something like a society within a society, a community of friends and neighbors. So it's funny to me that the sort of political strategies of the right and left are kind of converging. Although they should not put down every instrument of political resistance available to them. They should hold on to these and continue to use them. But they should, consider leaving and forming their own little societies within societies. This new clandestine life will have to make itself as autonomous as possible from all the institutions and will be tested periodically, but only they will be able to guarantee human survival in a world that has devoted itself more or less to conscious self-destruction. It's a powerful, a lot of this is really powerful, which is why I'm talking about it here. But yeah, so then he has another one about the green card, the green pass. And he says, in a previous text, we have shown the unjust discrimination of a class of citizens excluded from normal social life, which follows from the introduction of the green pass. This is a necessary and calculated consequence, but is not the main purpose, which is aimed not at the excluded citizens so much as the population as a whole, which has the green pass. The purpose pursued here is actually a meticulous and unconditional control of the movement of citizens, completely analogous to the internal passport, which in the Soviet Union, in the Soviet regime, everyone had to have in order to move from one state to another. In this case, the control is more absolute because it concerns any movement of the citizen who will have to exhibit the green pass in order to move throughout society, to the cinema, to a concert, to a restaurant. And so he actually says that the non-registered citizen will be paradoxically sort of more free than the citizen who has the green pass. And it's this mass of registered citizens that ought to be rebelling and protesting, because from now on, they will be registered, monitored, controlled to an unprecedented extent that even in the most totalitarian regimes was able to be done. He says it's significant now that China has announced, apparently, that it will maintain its tracking and control systems even after the end of the pandemic. As should be evident, he says the Green Pass is not about health, but about population control, and sooner or later, even members will have the opportunity to understand that it is members being people who use the Green Pass, I think, to understand that it's at their expense. Then he has another one on second-class citizens, and he says, as happens every time a despotic regime is established and constitutional guarantees are suspended, the result is the creation of a new category of men who automatically are turned into second-class citizens. He, of course, has to compare it to the Jews in Nazi Germany. Boring, but it is what it is. And he says that's the aim of the creation of the Green Pass. Discrimination based on personal beliefs and not on he just said in the other one that it's not exactly the aim. But he says this is one of the functions of the Green Pass, is that it produces this new category of second-class citizens. Discrimination against them being not on the basis of personal beliefs, or being based on the personal beliefs, not on some kind of objective scientific certainty. And he says that's illustrated by the fact that there is still ongoing debate about the safety and efficacy of the vaccines. There are doctors and scientists that there's really no reason to ignore, who warn that they were produced quickly and without adequate testing, etc. And he says, despite all this, those who stick to their free convictions, something you should be able to do, and refuse vaccination, will be totally excluded from public life. The vaccine is thus transformed into a sort of political religious symbol. This goes back to some of the other stuff you were talking about with Agamben, with other stuff that he wrote in the previous video, where he's talking about this new religion of health and healing and stuff like that, and science versus Christianity versus medicine, So it's turned into a sort of political religious symbol aimed at creating discrimination among citizens. And that's evident from the statements, I guess, of some politician in Italy who, referring to those who don't want to be vaccinated, was actually repeating what he calls fascist jargon by saying, we will purge them from society with the Green Pass. And he says, this green card makes those who don't have it effectively bearers of a virtual yellow star, which is, of course, what Jews in Nazi Germany had to wear, marked them as sort of extra-legal entities, right, as homo soccer in the way that we talked about before. This is a fact, the gravity of which cannot be overstated. What does a country become in which a discriminated class is created? How can one accept living with second-class citizenship? The fact that these discriminations are sanctioned now by law is a barbarism that we cannot accept. Okay, then he has this one on the face and death, and this sort of essay of his, in this sort of collection, are always kind of the most interesting to me. They're like poetic, phenomenological, historical, etc. And I really like these. But anyway, so he says, it seems that in the new planetary order that is taking shape, two things apparently unrelated to each other are destined to be just erased from society. The face on the one hand and death on the other. And so in this essay, he's trying to investigate the relationship between the face and death, why these would both be eliminated, why they would be eliminated together. And he says that the vision of one's own face and the face of others is a decisive experience for man, as was already known to the ancients. What is called the face, wrote Cicero, cannot exist in any animal except man. The Greeks, their word for slave was someone who's not his own master, was aproposon, which literally means faceless. So a slave is somebody who doesn't have a face. This, we preserve this in some sense in English with language like he's trying to save face and stuff like that. Of course, all living beings show themselves and communicate to each other, but only man makes the face the place of his recognition and the truth of him. Man is the animal that recognizes his face in the mirror and mirrors himself and recognizes himself in the face of the other. This stuff makes me think of Lacan in the mirror stage and things like that. This moment of recognition in which the idea of yourself is constituted, right? We have an idea of ourselves in a way that the animals do not. The face is in this sense both the similitas, the similar. It shows our similarity with other people, looking in their face, seeing our faces reflected in their faces, etc. And the simultas, the simultaneity, the being together of human beings. A faceless man is necessarily alone. And since man is a political animal, the disappearance of politics also means the removal of life. A child who, when born, no longer sees his mother's face risks being unable to conceive of human feelings. This is the stuff that hits home here. No less important than the relationship with the face is the relationship with the dead. Man is the animal that recognizes himself in his own face, and he's also the only animal that celebrates the dead, who has a cult of the dead. It's not surprising then that even the dead have a face, and that the erasing of the face goes hand in hand with the removal of death. And then he starts talking about this tradition in Rome in which you had kind of an image of family members after they die, a wax image of them that is kept in the house and things like that, kept in the atrium of people's homes. And he says the free man, that is defined by his participation in the political life and his image. His image is retained in the family, right? The inalienable right to keep the face of his ancestors and to exhibit it publicly in the festivals of the community. After burial and the funeral rites, writes Polybius, this wax image was placed in the most visible point of the home. The dead man in a wooden reliquary, and this image is, the wax face is made an exact resemblance, both in shape and color. These images were not only the object of private memory, but were the tangible sign of the alliance and solidarity between the living and the dead. It connects the living generation to the dead generation, right? And this is also connected in some sense to the public sphere, between past and present, and that this was an integral part of the life of the city, especially in ancient Rome. The idea of authority is really past, right? Auctoritas. Authority is past, it's the ancestors, it's traditions, etc. And he says this is why they played such an important part in public life, so much so that it's been possible to affirm that the right to images of the dead is the laboratory in which the right of the living is founded. This is so true that whoever committed a serious public crime in Rome lost the right to their image. And legend has it that so that means your families are being forgotten. You're forgotten publicly. You're erased in your death rather than being preserved by the living, through your death. And legend has it that when Romulus founded Rome, he had dug a pit called the mundus, the Latin word for world, into which he himself and each of his companions throw a handful of the earth from which they come. This pit was opened 3 times a year, and it was said that in those days the mani, the dead, emerged from it. The past and the present communicated. We understand then why a world without faces can only be a world without death. If the living lose their face, the dead become only numbers, which insofar as they had been reduced to their pure biological life, this is the to their zoological life, this is the Homo sacer, the bare life idea that we talked about again in the previous video. He's saying that, social existence, public existence, a life in which you're a citizen, in which you're protected by the laws, etc. and so forth, is being stripped of us. We're becoming just members of the species, numbers, reproductive elements, purely biological. The only things that matter for us are like death, right? Death and life. If the living lose their face, the dead become only numbers, which insofar as they had been reduced to their pure biological life, must die alone and without funerals, which we've seen. And if the face is the place where before any speech we communicate with our fellow men, through the face to face. This is all also like a reference to Levinas. All talk in philosophy about the face, it all sort of goes back to Levinas. Who's interesting. I do suggest you read him. Although I disagree with him a lot. He's saying that ethics has to be prior to fundamental ontology, right? He's arguing against Heidegger, as everyone after Heidegger is doing. Then even the living, deprived of their relationship with the face, are irreparably alone, however much they try to communicate with their digital devices. So this planetary project that governments are trying to impose is radically unpolitical, in the sense that we're separated from the face and from death. Both of these things are intrinsically tied into the political. It proposes to eliminate every genuine political element from human existence, to replace it with a governmentality based on algorithmic control. Facial cancellation, the removal of the dead, and social distancing are the essential devices of this new governmentality, which according to the agreed declarations of the powerful must be maintained even when the sanitary terror, I like this phrase, he uses it a few times in these, is eased. But a society without a face, without a past, and without physical contact is a society of ghosts, as such doomed to a more or less rapid ruin. He's got some poetry and stuff. He's got a section where he has a couple quotes from Simone Weil. She's like a kind of mystic philosopher. If I remember correctly, she was in the same class as Sartre, and she finished first and he finished second in their class at the École Normale Supérieure or whatever. She's cool. She's like a Christian mystic type or whatever. But she's philosophically interesting. And he has a couple of quotes of hers, and they're sort of apropos. One of them is about the characteristic psychopolitical atmosphere of situations of tyranny. And she talks about how people think that the observation of widespread discontent in such situations is kind of a testament to the fragility of power, of the tyrannical power. But she says, in fact, it's the opposite of that. And that people can remain discontented forever, as long as their discontent, as their misery is combined with an absence of hope. And I think That's true. Then he's got one on bare life and the vaccine. Several times in my previous interventions, I have evoked the figure of bare life. Again, this goes back to his book. Homo soccer, bare life. I believe I talked extensively about it in a previous video of his. And it's like the Zoe versus Bios. Bios is like the life of man, of men, of the political animal of man, whereas Zoe is, merely biological, that only has his life, And so this figure of the Homo sacer is someone who's reduced to bare life. The Homo sacer being another reference to a juridical tradition in ancient Rome in which somebody was marked as Homo sacer, as a sacred man, and that meant that he was no longer under the protections of the city. The laws didn't apply to him. He could be killed with impunity because his life is not protected, right, by the law. His rights are not protected by the law. He's not a citizen. He's a Homo sacer. He's been reduced to an animal. He's been ejected from the bios. That's the Homo sacer. And the state of exceptions are, in some sense, states of governmentality in which there's a zone of indeterminacy where you can become a Homo sacer at any moment, right? That's sort of a really brief rundown because I think I talked about it elsewhere. But in fact, it seems to me that the epidemic shows beyond any possible doubt that humanity no longer believes in anything except in the bare existence, which is to be preserved for them at any price, as in at the price of their institutions of society. The Christian religion, with its works of love and mercy and with its faith to the point of martyrdom, political ideology with its unconditional solidarity, even trust in work and money, seems to take second place as soon as bare life is threatened, albeit in the form of a risk, who, in this case, whose statistical entity is fleeting and deliberately indeterminate. He talks periodically throughout these in terms of the statistics and what the actual risks represented by COVID seem to be and things like that. He's not very impressed. And he says, the time has come to clarify the meaning and origin of this concept. For this, it is necessary to remember that the human is not something that can be defined once and for all. Rather, it is the place of an incessantly updated historical decision, which each time fixes the boundary that separates man from animal, and what is human in man from what is not human, in order to be what is not human in him and outside of him. Therefore, Homo sapiens, as Linnaeus, named us, sapiens being wisdom, because we're the wise animal. We're the animal that has to recognize himself as human in order to be so and so. And he talks about how Linnaeus had difficulty figuring out what it is exactly that differentiates us from our ape cousins or whatever. And it's this self-recognition component. That's why he eventually went with sapiens. We're the animal that has to recognize himself as human in order to be so. And for this reason, he must decide the human from the non-human. The device through which this decision takes place historically can be called an anthropological machine. The machine works by excluding animal life from man and producing human through this exclusion and this boundary between bios and zoe. Everything in the outside of the boundaries of the polis is zoe, and everything inside is bios. We're human beings, they're animals. That's why the state of exception creates an indeterminacy with respect to that categorization, right? And that's why it's politically terrible and such a focus for Agamben. And he says, but for the machine to work, exclusion must also be an inclusion. That between the two poles, the animal and the human, there is an articulation and a threshold together that divides and joins them. The point at which it's one or the other, right? This joint. And he says, this joint, this articulation, is bare life. That is, a life that is neither properly animal nor truly human, but in which the decision between the human and the non-human takes place every time. This threshold, which necessarily passes inside of men, separating biological from social life within him, is an abstraction in a virtuality homo sacer. What is the figure of bare life that is in question today in the management of the pandemic? It is not so much the patient who is isolated and treated as never before have patients been in the history of medicine, but rather it's the infected person, or as it has been defined with a kind of contradictory formula, even the asymptomatic patient. That is something that every man is virtually without knowing it. In question is not so much health, but rather a life that is neither healthy nor sick, which as such is potentially pathogenic, potentially infectious, and can be deprived of its freedoms and subjected to prohibition and control of all kinds. In this sense, all men are virtually asymptomatic patients. The only identity of this life fluctuating between disease and health is to be the recipient of the swab and the vaccine, which, like the baptism of a new religion, again, go back to the stuff that we talked about in the previous one, they define the inverted figure of what was once called citizenship. Baptism is no longer indelible. This is very important, I think, but necessarily provisional and renewable. You've got to constantly update your green pass. You're not allowed in society now unless you have 3 vaccines. Next time, unless you have 4 vaccines. You have to be boosted. You have to, you have to get swabbed so many times or whatever, So citizenship has to be constantly renewed. You're having to jump through these biosecurity hoops in order to not be reduced to bare life. Because the new citizen, who must always show his certificate, no longer has inalienable and irremovable rights, but only obligations that must be incessantly decided and updated. He has one on war and peace, in which he says, it's necessary to take seriously the thesis repeated many times by various governments that humanity and all nations are currently at war. There's a global war, a global civil war. A thesis like this obviously serves to, and remember all the language with the pandemic, with biosecurity, with the threat of COVID, etc. It's all been the rhetoric of war, right? It's a war on the virus. It's necessary to take that language seriously, he's saying. And it obviously serves to legitimize the state of exception with its drastic limitations on the freedom of movement and absurd expressions like that of curfew that would otherwise be difficult for governments to justify. The bond between the powers of government and the war is more intimate and consubstantial than this, however. The fact is that war is something that they cannot in any way permanently do without. War is necessary for governments to continue to exist and function, he's saying. Peace in the long run is ungovernable because there's no necessity in peace. It's just little people doing little things all the time, exercising their freedom, being free, making capricious decisions, etc. Right? It's all this small stuff. There's no necessity, which makes it less calculable, right? Which makes it less easy to predict and manage in terms of security, in terms of biosecurity, in terms of public administration. And so he's saying, although it can be subjected to limits and controls, it tends by its nature to escape calculation. Or at least that's the secret fear of those in power. This can also be expressed by saying that history, without which power would be unthinkable, is strictly in solidarity with war. That life in peace is by definition a historical life. This is something that I agree with, but I have kind of a different take on it with than Agamben. For this reason, the powers that be who want to rule the world must sooner or later resort to war of some kind, right? It's a necessity in order to have history, in order to have control, in order to calculate, in order to manage life, human life. no matter whether it's real or carefully simulated. And since in the state of peace, the life of men tends to come out of every historical dimension, it is not surprising that governments today don't tire of remembering that the war on the virus marks the beginning of a new historical epoch in which nothing will ever be the same again. And many who blindfold themselves so as not to see the situation of unfreedom into which they have fallen accept it precisely because they're convinced, not without a hint of pride, that they are entering, after almost 70 years of peaceful life, that is, 70 years without history, into a new era. Even if, as is all too evident, it will be an age of servitude and sacrifice, in which everything that makes life worth living will suffer mortification and restriction, they nevertheless willingly submit themselves to it because they believe stolidly to have found in this way for their life meaning which, without realizing it, they had lost during the years of peace. It is possible, however, that the war on the virus, which seemed to be an ideal device for this, because governments can measure and direct according to need much more easily than they can with a real war, ends up, like all war, getting out of hand. And perhaps at that point, if it is not too late, men will once again seek that ungovernable peace which they have so unwisely abandoned. He has one on will and necessity. The question of whether governments are consciously using the pandemic to declare a state of exception that strengthens their powers beyond all limits, or whether they have no choice but to install these emergency provisions, declarations, is misplaced. He says what happens today, as in every crisis, is that both of them are true. Both of them are true simultaneously. The use of the state of exception as a stratagem and the impossibility of governing otherwise coincide with one another. The sovereign, while acting in an absolutely arbitrary way, is forced to make an incessant decision on the exception. This is the language of Schmidt, which is where he gets the state of exception idea, which ultimately defines its nature. The era we're living in, that is, the one in which the illegitimacy of the powers that govern the earth appear to us in full light, since they have lost any possibility of configuring themselves in a recognizable symbolic order, they're obligated to suspend the law and the constitutional principles that might define it. This is kind of a theme in some of these too, where he's talking about how we have entered into an era in which the sort of failures of bourgeois democracies have become too apparent, and so they're having to resort to these really extreme measures, the suspension of law, etc., in order to hold on to power in the face of their loss of legitimacy among the population. So to me, this kind of stuff coincides with like the Trump phenomenon and election integrity and stuff like that a lot. In this sense, the state of exception becomes the normal state, and whoever governs cannot under any circumstances govern otherwise. It is perhaps possible that the state of exception could be formally revoked, but a government of national salvation, such as the one that is taking shape, this, again, confluence of the religious, the sacred, and the political state governmentality, in which all opposition ceases, is the perfect continuation of the state of exception. Our diagnosis of a definite decline in the age of bourgeois democracies is in any case confirmed. He's got some short ones about how, eventually at the summit of civilization, we go through this kind of dialectical process where, we abandon God for reason, abandon reason for, we end up abandoning reason too, and we abandon blah, 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 blah. Eventually, expert opinion comes to the point, again, where we just believe in ghosts. He's got some others about the tiny degree of risk defined by the government, like I said, about all this stuff, and that's what's causing us to shut down and renounce our freedoms and what makes life worth living. Contact with people, making memories, celebrating holidays together. He's like, this is that we're shutting down because of these tiny statistical risks, because of the projected risks, etc. Then he has one that's pretty interesting on contact philosophy. And he says, two bodies come into contact by touching. But what does it mean to touch? What is touch? What is contact? And he refers to Giorgio Agamben, I don't know who that is, who defines contact as when 2 points are separated only by a vacuum of representation, of unrepresentability. So contact is not a point of contact between two things. It's when they're so close that the distance can't be elaborated, articulated, right? Can't be thought. Nothing can be inserted in between them. No medium can be inserted in between them. Because, so contact is not a point of contact because that cannot exist, a point of contact, because any continuous quantity can be divided. Okay? If their proximity can be represented, they're not in contact, but only when all representation fails. If there's no definable something, but only nothing that separates them, then, contact is unrepresentable. But the defect of this definition, he says, is that relying exclusively on negative expressions like that, it risks fading into a kind of mysticism, meaning that contact, touch, is sort of like the same as talking about like mystical union with God. Like it's a impossibility that has to be, sort of inscribed into the possible as impossible in some way. This kind of like apophatic theology of touch. And he says, Coley himself says that this immediate proximity can only ever be understood approximately. So again, he's saying it's basically impossible. That representation as such can never be totally eliminated here. There's always sort of something representable, right? Like I can call it unrepresentable. And so, contact is only ever approximate contact. And he says, so let's go back. We don't like this idea. Why we're talking about it, I don't know. But then he says, what is touch? This most humble and earthly of the senses, right? That's what we need to get back to. This humble touch, it seems so simple, right? For every sense, he says, there is a metaxy that is functionally decisive. So for sight, the diaphanous, right, which gets illuminated with color, becomes the medium that strikes the eye in some sense, or that the eye registers, and so we see things. For hearing, you make a sound, you hit the wall or whatever, and air is a kind of diaphanous medium, a kind of what he calls a metaxy that communicates, the sonic impression to our ear. So it's got this medium too. And he's saying this stuff is difficult in translation. This essay in particular, but this is my explanation of it. And so, but he's saying touch is different than that. We don't have sonic body, metaxy, medium that communicates that impact through the vibration of this medium of the air that then is registered in the ear. With touch, the medium here is the skin itself. It is me. And when I'm being touched, that's also how I become aware of tactile sensibility, right? Of the existence of this sense. The medium is the thing itself, and the impression on the medium is, demonstrates the existence of the medium to you, and the medium is me, right? So he's like, touch is very interesting in this sense, because when something comes into contact with the skin also comes into contact with itself, with me, with myself as having this form of sensibility, and with each other. It's never like one sort of monad of touch. There's it's always sort of multifold. We come into contact thus with our own ability to touch and be touched, right? Me touching you and you touching me, they're both kind of the same phenomenon. And by being touched, I learned that I can touch, etc. And so he says contact with another body is always thus also self-contact, And touch, therefore, which seems often to be inferior to the other senses in some way, is actually the first of the senses, because in it, something like a subject is produced. We get subjectivity from touch because there's this reflexive movement. We have an experience of ourselves in being touched. Touching and being touched simultaneously, right? For the first time, whenever we touch another body, we're touching ourselves. We're ourselves experiencing our sensation of touch. And so he says, if as we try to do today, abolish all contact with social distancing, we're not supposed to kiss, we're not supposed to hug, whatever. That's the point of this meditation on touch. If we try to abolish touch, then we abolish contact. Then in some sense, we also lose our own ability to experience other bodies and to have immediate experience of ourselves. So we lose, he says, purely and simply our meat, our organism, right? Then he's got this other